people you belong to? What if church showed up where real life happens?
Hey, good morning. How are you? Little brain fog? Me too. So glad you're here. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here this morning. If we haven't had a chance to meet, my name's Shane, and I look forward to meeting you when we're done here today. Several things to talk about, but the main point today is that we are going to talk a little bit about temptation. And as I was thinking about temptation, it's probably true of all of us that temptation, and for me it always is, temptation is an invitation to embrace self-interest. Have you really noticed that? Is that when I'm tempted to do something, it's always from a perspective, or at least from my perspective, of something that's going to be beneficial to me. Or I think it's going to be beneficial to me. But it certainly is all about me in that temptation. Like, I am never tempted to be selfless, right? I'm never tempted. I am never tempted to be overly generous. In fact, whenever I have an inclination to be selfless, like, I think I'll give up my Saturday and go help them, or I think I'll take a half a day off work and go volunteer at this organization, or I think I'm going to do that, or not do what I need to do in order to help somebody else. Or maybe I'm going to write a check to an organization that's in need. Whenever I get that feeling that I should be selfless, I don't consider that a temptation. Do you? You know what we consider that? We consider that not temptation. We consider that, am I a great person or what? Because that's what we think. But it's kind of the same thing. It's like I'm sort of tempted to do something selfless, and then I'm tempted to do something selfish. But I tend to be more successful at overcoming temptations towards selflessness than I am overcoming the temptations towards selfishness. And then I've learned, and in fact, I think we've all learned, and maybe some of you are in the middle of this right now, maybe it's why you're watching, maybe it's why you're here, or maybe it's why you're in church today. We just learned this over time, that in our pursuit of our own self-interest, that we eventually hurt ourselves, and oftentimes we hurt other people. And then Jesus comes along, and he was just so brilliant, because he said, if you live a self-centered life, in other words, if you make life all about you, all about self, then in the end, you don't just hurt yourself. And this is so powerful. In fact, this is maybe where you are, and maybe just don't have these exact words for what's going on. Jesus said, in the end, if you make life all about you, in the end, you don't just hurt yourself. In the end, you actually lose yourself. So today we are in part 5 of our series, Church Does Not Equal. And if you've been tracking along with us, we've been talking about this very strange little word here, ecclesia, right? Which this word ecclesia is actually a Greek term that describes Jesus' movement from the first century. We call this movement, of course, the church, but that's a real unfortunate term that we have in our English Bible, because it does not mean church. This word ecclesia literally means assembly. And specifically in the first century, an assembly of people called together to do something very specific. And in Jesus' case, it was an assembly of people devoted to following him and living the way that he was teaching, and then inviting others, in fact, inviting the whole world to join in and to live out those same Jesus ethics that he was teaching. And so in this series, what we've been doing is we have been looking back to the first century to make sure that we stay on track in our century. And so it's interesting, while expressions of faith, they just change. The way this is played out changed from generation to generation and culture to culture. Jesus' original mission for his assembly has not changed. And so we can't afford, if we're going to call ourselves Jesus followers and a part of his assembly, his ecclesia, or what we call the church, we can't afford to lose sight of that original intent, because historically, you've seen this, that when a church veers from that original intent, things just get weird. And so there's just so much at stake when it comes to the church getting this right. We've got to get it right, and we've got to keep on mission. And so what we've been doing is we've been following the storyline of the first century church launch of Jesus' movement, his ecclesia, that again today we call the church. So wouldn't you agree that we want our leaders locally, nationally, our kids' ball coaches, our teachers, our superintendents, our church leaders, our pastors, leaders in families, wouldn't you agree that we want them to model the ethics and morals that we want in our society? And of course, we would all say, yes, that would be ideal if they would. And in many cases, we want to define them. We want them to define them, not just model them. And when they don't, people pay the price. In fact, people get hurt. And it was no different in Jesus' day as he came onto the scene, because he defined what his movement would look like, but he also modeled what should happen. Modeling it so that there basically would never be any confusion about what he intended his ecclesia, his movement, his assembly, the church, us. He modeled it so there would not be any confusion of what it should be like. And the very first defined ethic that Jesus began to model actually happened immediately as he stepped onto the national stage. Here's what happened. John the Baptist, who was Jesus' cousin, but he was the opening act for Jesus. And many people followed John the Baptist, but when Jesus showed up, John immediately said, "This is the one I've been telling you about. This is the one that's coming. Follow him." In fact, that day when John said that down by the river, a couple of John's followers actually left John and went and followed Jesus. But before they did, John baptized Jesus, which that's kind of an interesting thing all of on its own. But once he did, here's what happened immediately after John pointed out Jesus as the Son of God and Jesus got baptized. Immediately after, here's what happened. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the Diablos, which is where we get our word diabolical, the slanderer, the accuser, in our English Bibles, the devil. Now, this is really interesting little piece of narrative here. And of all the things that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could have written down about Jesus, why did they include this little story of what happened? Why was this so important, and as strange as it is, and as odd as it is, and as many questions as it makes us ask, for all of us, and for the ones who were writing it, why in the world would these guys include this little bit of Jesus' life story? And the answer is, it's not a lesson on how to overcome temptation, although there are certainly some takeaways for us. It's way bigger than that. It's more epic than that. And what happens next is central to the story of Jesus and for us, his movement. Because Jesus, throughout his life, was tempted to opt for the old ways, even though he came to establish new ways and introduce the new way. The old way being the me first, the kingdoms of this world way, which were temptations throughout his entire life. And so here's how this whole thing with the devil went down right after Jesus' baptism. And I want you to note that after this spiritual high moment, immediately into temptation. Here's how it went down. So after 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Okay, thank you, Captain Obvious Matthew, right? Of course he was hungry. 40 days. Why would he include this? Here's why I think he included this. Is because he wanted his readers to know this was a human. This was a person. If you didn't eat for 40 days, you'd be hungry. So he was hungry, and he was weak and vulnerable. And it's as if he was saying to the tempter, come on, give me your best shot. I want to know how serious, I want you to know how serious I am about the new that I've come to introduce into the world. And so look, and the tempter came to him. Now, it's a new Greek word, which basically means inquisitor. It means tester. It means a person who's going to try to get out of him what nobody else can get out of him. And so the tempter came to him and he said, here's what he said. If you're the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. In other words, just speak it. If you're the Son of God, then it'll be done. Because, look, I mean, I read the first part of your book, Jesus. God spoke the universe into being, so certainly if you're the Son of God, you could speak and some stones would become bread. And besides that, you're entitled to that. You're hungry. Come on, Jesus. You are you. You deserve this. And Jesus responds to his first temptation by leaning into the old covenant, like the one between God and Israel, what we call the Old Testament. Because even though he had come to establish the new, he functioned under the rules and the laws of his day, the Old Covenant. And so he leans into that, and Jesus quotes from the Old Testament in his answer, and he answers this. It is written, man shall not live by bread alone. And he takes us back to this picture of the nation of Israel traveling through the wilderness as they wander around and there's nothing to eat. And God provides bread. And in those years, God was teaching his people to depend on him every single day. We call it daily bread, daily dependence. And so Jesus finishes it out, and here's what he says. He says, you don't live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. In other words, even though I'm the Son of God and I have been sent into the world to do something new for the world, I will not act on my own independently of my Heavenly Father. Because to do so is sow kingdoms of this world. Then, we move on to the second temptation. The devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple there in Jerusalem. And so they go to the highest point of the temple, which in that day, which would have been the southeast corner, where you look down hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet into the Kidron Valley. And so the tempter says to Jesus, okay, that one didn't work about the bread. Let's try this one. He says, if you're the Son of God, keep saying that, throw yourself down. Like people would notice, because that would be a big deal. I mean, like a lot of people saw you got baptized in the Jordan River a few minutes ago, and that was a big deal, but it was like, wait, who is this guy again? He says, but I'm telling you, if you throw yourself off of this point down to that ravine, and then you shake it off and walk away, that's going to be spectacular. So if you're the Son of God, just do it and prove it. And then the tempter quotes the Old Testament to Jesus, like, hey, two can play at this game. I read the book too. And he quotes Psalm 91, and he says, come on, Jesus, throw yourself down because, he says, because God will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against the stone. You will land so lightly if you're really the Son of God. In other words, he taunts Jesus. And he said, didn't God promise to take care of you? Don't you have faith in this Father you say you have? Come on, Jesus. Don't you believe him? And in this moment, he was tempting Jesus to do what oftentimes we're tempted to do. And he was tempting Jesus to try to use God. And this is unfortunate. It's unfortunate, but that is the modern version of the church today. That is the modern version of faith. The faith that maybe some of you were brought up in, and maybe the faith that you chose to leave, and maybe it's the reason you haven't been back. The faith that says, if you just believe, then you'll receive. If you just believe enough, if you've got enough faith, if your faith is big enough, quote a verse, God has to come through for you. But Jesus answered that. He said, oh, no, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. And the point for us is simply this. If you're a Christian, and look, this may be a little disturbing, but the moment that you begin trying to manipulate God, the moment you begin looking for a magic formula to get God to do what you want to do, the moment you begin thinking, if I do these three things consistently, God has to do something for me, In that moment, you are no longer practicing Christianity. You're practicing magic. And your religion has become superstitious. Jesus would say to those who gathered around to hear him speak, look, when you think of God, God is not a king in heaven that can be bribed or manipulated. He is not sitting with his arms crossed waiting for you to bring enough gifts or sacrifices or offerings or say enough prayers or to say the right prayer or to do enough good deeds that you finally get his attention. That's not the God in heaven. When you think of God from now on, he's saying, I want you to think of a perfect heavenly Father who already knows what you need. He does not need to be talked into something. He cannot be bribed. You come as children to him and simply ask. Now, those were the first two temptations, and Jesus got through those, and he passed. And he gets to the third one, which I think is the main event of the fight. I think the first two are like the first two rounds of warm-up. But we get to the third, but not the final temptation, because this third temptation ends up being repeated over and over and over throughout Jesus' ministry. And we come to the main event. But before we get to that, I want to talk about us for just a minute, and then we'll get to that main event. And here's the question that I just want to ask today. Why are powerful people so inclined to go off the rails? Why is that? We've all seen it. We've all watched it. Some of us are watching it right now play out in real life. Why are powerful people so inclined to go off the rails morally, ethically, financially? I mean, why is that? I mean, you would think that the more power a person had, the better person they would be. They would have less financial pressure. Nobody's telling them what to do. They've got all this freedom to do what they want to do. You would think with more freedom and more independence and more wealth, a person would just get better and better. Why is it that powerful people oftentimes go off the rails? I mean, where does that come from? Why isn't it the opposite of that? Why do powerful people most often make it all about themselves? I have the power. I'm stronger. I have more influence. I can control your future. I can control your profession. I can control which opportunities you get or you don't get. Where does that come from? I mean, is it arrogance? Is it just dismissiveness? Just whatever. You're just the little people and I'm up here. Is it elitism? Is it like this extravagant consumerism? People who just spend so much money on more and more and more stuff, and they're a little bit generous over here, and they're a little generous over there, and they think they're so generous. But then you look at, because all they're looking at is the dollar amount. They're not looking at the percentage. I mean, where does that come from? What is that? Because you think like I think, wow, if I had that much influence, if I had that much power, if I had that much wealth, I would just be the best person. I would be way better person than that. Why is it that power generally doesn't make people better? It makes them worse. Why does power corrupt? Why is it that there are just so few stories of extraordinarily wealthy, powerful people that actually end well? What is that? And here's the great thing, and this is why I think you should follow Jesus. Even if you don't believe he's the Son of God, you should follow Jesus, because other people have too. Because throughout Jesus' ministry and life and his time on earth, Jesus taught and he modeled something that maybe you've heard about. It may not be new to us, but I'm telling you it was absolutely new in the first century. Because what he taught and modeled was that power is not primarily for the benefit of the powerful. And in that day, no one had ever heard such a thing. That's not the way the world works. You can't get stuff done that way. It's like, Jesus, if you're going to start a movement, is somehow you're going to move the needle on this whole thing and change what's happening in the vicinity of your hometown in Jerusalem and Judea and Galilee and the rest of the world. That isn't going to work. That's super upside down from the way the world works. And then he also taught that wealth is not primarily for the benefit of the wealthy. I mean, Jesus talks so much about money, and Jesus consistently said that wealth is a stewardship, that it all belongs to our Father in heaven, and that wealth, just like power, is a test. It's a test to see how well you do, and how well you do is judged not by what you spend on yourself, but how generous you become with other people if you can be trusted with more wealth later. And very, very few people pass the wealth test. And I know that when I say that, I know exactly what you're thinking. I'd like to sign up for the test because I'd like to try that, because I think I actually might could do that. So where do you sign up for the wealth test? And it's true, if you're listening to me right now or you're watching me, let me just tell you, you are already taking the test. And here's the reason why. 90% of the people in the world consider you, at whatever level you're at, wealthy. And you know what you do. You do what I do. You think, I'm not wealthy. I might be middle, maybe. And then there's the super rich, and they're the rich. That's who Jesus was really after. That's who Jesus was concerned with. And Jesus will say throughout his ministry, wait. Let me just ask you, what do you have in your hand? And what do you think that is for? And who do you think that is for? Well, I earned it. I deserve it. And Jesus says consistently, that's kingdoms of this world. That's the way the world works. But I've come to introduce something new, so not so with you, my followers. And then Jesus would teach this, that influence is not primarily for the benefit of the influencer. And that's why this is such an epic battle of temptation. This is why the whole story begins here, that throughout Jesus' ministry, he would be tempted right up until the very last night on earth. Throughout his life, he would be tempted to go kingdoms of this world and to take what was rightfully his and to leverage what he could leverage for himself. And that's why I think this third temptation was the main event. So again, the devil took him to a high mountain, and he showed him all the kingdoms of the world. And Matthew doesn't stop there. He doesn't leave it there. It's not just all the kingdoms of the world, but he adds this point, and their splendor. It's as if the tempter was saying to Jesus, feast your eyes on this, because I know this is why you're here. And he says this, all of this I will give you. It's been given to me, and I can give it to anybody I want. And besides, Jesus, I know you're here for the whole world. This is what you've come for. Isn't that what everyone wants? I mean, isn't this what you want, Jesus, to be recognized? To have your fair share? To have a little bit more power and a little bit more glory and a little bit more wealth and a little bit more influence and leverage? I mean, imagine if someone offered you the kingdoms of the world. And he said to Jesus, all you have to do is just bow down and worship me. All you have to do is recognize that all of this is mine to give. And not, Jesus, not even for the rest of your life, but for one moment, recognize this is mine. And I just want you to leverage your worship for my sake. After all, Jesus, this is what you came for. After all, we both know ultimately it's yours anyway, and you are entitled to it. And come on, who refuses what they're entitled to? Who refuses what they deserve? Who refuses what's coming their way? I mean, who does that? Well, I'll tell you who does that. People that you have the most respect for. Great people. And here's the point. Jesus had not come to trade for a kingdom. Jesus had come to establish a new covenant with everyone in the world. A movement that said wealth was not for the wealthy and power was not exclusively for the powerful and influence isn't to be leveraged for those who have all the influence. He said, my movement, my kingdom is like no other. It is upside down kingdom from what you know as kingdoms of the world. I have a kingdom where the subjects aren't required to lay down their lives for the king. I have a kingdom where the king will lay down his life for the subjects. And there had never been such a thing. And anyone outside watching would have just said, come on, it just doesn't work that way. And then Jesus said, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. And look, and when the devil had finished all his tempting, he left him until an opportune time. In effect, saying, in other words, okay, I'll go, but I want you to know this is just round one and we aren't done. And I will be back to convince you to opt for the ways of the kingdom of this world. And then the text tells us that immediately Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. And then just for fun, and maybe just perhaps to spite the devil, instead of turning stones into bread, you know what Jesus does? He goes to a wedding and he turns water into wine. And not for himself, but for the guest and to honor the host. And do you know why Jesus turned water into wine? Because his mama asked him to. Which I think is kind of the point of the whole story, is just say yes to your mama and not to the devil. Here's the real point. Jesus early on was offered at some level, to some extent, what we all want. But he refused it because he had not come to take over. Jesus had come to take away the sins of the world. And as many times as he said it and modeled it, and as many times as he taught it and illustrated it, his followers still can't get that's why he's there. They're still thinking, okay, we know the way the world works out there. Those are all good sermons, and yeah, but we know how it works. We know how authority works. We know about the top person, and the top person tells the next level what to do, and then they tell the next one. We know how it works. We're in that system. We've seen it all our lives. It is kingdoms of the world. It is just the way of things. And so Jesus sets them all down, and he says, guys, come on. Guys, look at me. And here's what he would say to them. Even the Son of Man, even me, I did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life a ransom for many. He's like, guys, I'm serious. We're not going the way of the kingdoms of the world. The me first. I'm in it for me. What can I get out of the kingdoms of the world? And I know that it's all you can see. And I know it's all that you know. And I know it's the way the world works right now. And I know that's what you've seen in other plans. And you've never seen it work out what I'm telling you. But I want you to know, I'm not backing off of this. This is why I've come. And I'm going to stay the course all the way to the end. And here's why this is important for you. Regardless of your religious belief or your background. Do you know what Jesus valued more than kingdoms of the world and power and influence? He valued you because you are a part of the many that he came to ransom his life for you. Because regardless of how much power you have, you don't have the power to overcome the consequence of your sin in your life, do you? He came to ransom you because regardless of how much money you have or don't have, no amount of money can heal a broken relationship and get you forgiveness from someone you love. And no amount of influence can reverse the consequences of sin in your life or my life. The kingdoms and the values of this world, they don't even intersect in any kind of meaningful way with the things that are most important to the human heart and soul. So he came to be a ransom for many, and regardless of what you believe, and regardless of what maybe you've been taught, you are a part of the many. And do you know what hung in the balance of Jesus' decision to resist the temptation and to embrace the kingdoms of this world? You. You hung in the balance. And do you know what hangs in the balance of your decision not to embrace the kingdoms of this world? Someone on the outside who is watching you hangs in the balance. And you know what? And you already know this. When you live your life for you, you just get smaller, don't you? When life is all about you, it's not much of a life. And the reason I'm tempted and you're tempted every single days of our lives is to do it all for us. The power for me, the wealth is for me, the influence is for me. How do I get more so that my life will be better and better and better? And we've all seen it. And we all know. And in the end, we're smaller. We're not better. And Jesus said, that's why I've come. I've come that you might have life, and when it's all about you, it's not much of a life. In fact, he would ask this question. He'd say, come on, hey, I think he would ask us today, hey, Americans, come on. Middle class, upper middle class, come on. Rich people, come on. People who are trying to get theirs, come on, come on. Let's just be really honest. Let's be authentic as we can be. You know enough to know this is true. What do you really get out of all of that? And here's how Jesus actually asked the question. He said, what good is it if you gain the whole world? What good is it if you become the wealthiest, most powerful, most influential person? What good is it if you gain the whole world, but in the end, you end up losing or forfeiting you? Selfishness at the end of the day leads to a loss of the very thing you're trying to gain and save. And you know this. In fact, you knew that before I ever said it. Because the people who have the biggest lives and the people who make the biggest difference and the people that we admire the most are most selfless. And we just rarely see that done well. Jesus said, so I've come to establish an assembly, a group, a gathering, the church, that's all about power being leveraged for the powerless. I want in my assembly, I want the wealth to be leveraged for those that are in need. And in my ecclesia, I want influence to be leveraged for those who do not have a voice. And as I've said throughout this series, and it's difficult for us to really comprehend, but when you think about it, we are that ecclesia for our generation. When people outside of our church or any church, people who have left the Christian faith think about or look at us, the church, I'm telling you, they don't look at the first century church. They don't even look at the church from 10 years ago. They don't pick up a Bible and say, what are Christians really all about? They open their door and they look down the street and see you get into your car and they look at you. And when they see us leverage power for ourselves or only leverage our wealth for ourselves or use our influence for us and not for those without a voice, it's no wonder they want nothing to do with us. Would you? Because they know Jesus set the upside down ethics, and they can just smell that something doesn't match. So we've got to get this right individually, which means you and I have to figure out how to assume the posture and the tone and the approach of our Savior, because you and I are representatives of our King, and collectively we are his movement.